In the 16th century, a man was strangled and burned at the stake.
Right, William Tyndale.
Yeah, William Tyndale. And his crime wasn't leading some violent rebellion, and he didn't introduce a new heretical god.
No, his crime was, well, translating Greek verbs into English with too much precision.
Which is wild to think about today. But the authorities back then understood something that we kind of often forget.
Oh, for sure.
Translating the syntax of the Bible is not this neutral mathematical currency exchange where you just swap one word for another.
Right, it's not a direct one-to-one swap.
No, Tyndale died because he knew that if you change the grammar of the text, you change who holds the authority.
That is a massive statement.
It is. And today, we're looking at why a single verb tense has the ability to build or completely dismantle entire religious empires. Welcome to Reformed thinking.
It's going to be a good one.
For this deep dive, we're pulling from two specific sources. The first is a paper titled The Sovereignty of Syntax, and the second is an essay called The Verbs of the Living Word.
Both really dense, fascinating texts.
Yeah, and our goal today is to look at how the translation of action words, so verbs, from the original biblical languages into English shapes theological orthodoxy.
It is a massive topic. I mean, to grasp the scale of this translation debate, we have to look at the architectural framework of the original languages compared to our modern English versions.
Right.
The choices made by a translator sitting in a quiet office, they don't just affect how a sentence sounds when read aloud on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, it goes way beyond aesthetics.
Spot on. Those choices dictate the theological reality you walk away with. When a translator alters a verb, they alter the action of God.
We really need to set the stakes right out of the gate for everyone listening. This is not some dry academic exercise in linguistics.
No, not at all.
We're not talking about scholars arguing over commas in a dusty library. The sources argue that grammatical choices alter the entire understanding of salvation, human ability, and divine action.
We are talking about the bedrock of what people believe about God and themselves.
We really are.
Yeah.
And I also need to state up front that our source materials contain some pretty strong theological critiques against specific frameworks.
Yeah, they do not hold back.
They don't. The authors take direct aim at Arminianism, Roman Catholicism, and liberal theology.
Right, and our job today is to impartially report the arguments made by those authors.
Yeah, we're going to objectively relay how the sources view these theological camps without endorsing the viewpoints ourselves.
We are functioning as neutral guides to the texts we have in front of us.
That is a helpful distinction to make. The texts make definitive claims about those groups based entirely on grammar, and our job is to map out the logic of those claims.
And to start that mapping, we have to understand the difference between nouns and verbs in the biblical text.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Well, nouns identify the cast and the concepts. Words like God, sin, grace, covenant, and Israel. They give us the who and the what.
Right, the basic subjects.
Yeah, but the verbs carry the movement of revelation. Verbs tell us what actually happened, created, redeemed, died, raised, justified. They are the engine of the sentence.
The engine, I like that.
And the sources bring up the Westminster Confession of Faith, specifically section I.8, which asserts verbal plenary inspiration.
Which means what for the person who hasn't heard that term?
It means inspiration extends to the specific words and syntactic structures of the original text, not just broad concepts or general ideas.
So, if I'm understanding that correctly, verbal plenary inspiration means God didn't just drop a vague, cloudy concept of grace into the Apostle Paul's mind and say, write something about this.
Right. It's much more precise than that.
It means the Holy Spirit is responsible for the conjunctions, the prepositions, and the voice of the verbs. The specific syntax is divinely given.
Yes. And that brings up a historical divide in how translators approach their work. The sources highlight a major shift in translation philosophy over time.
Okay, let's unpack this. What kind of shift?
Well, early translators like Tyndale, alongside versions like the Geneva Bible, the KJV, the NASB, and the ESV, they utilized something called formal correspondence.
Formal correspondence.
Yeah, it's a word-for-word, structure-for-structure approach. They tried to map the English as closely to the original Greek and Hebrew grammar as possible, even if it made the English sound a bit clunky.
Like it didn't flow perfectly in conversational English,
Yeah.
but it was structurally accurate.
Spot on. But in the 20th century, a linguist named Eugene Nida popularized a different method called dynamic equivalence.
You hear that called thought-for-thought translation sometimes, right?
Yes. You see this method a lot in the NIV or the NLT. The priority there is modern readability.
So the goal is to make it sound smooth to our ears.
Basically. The goal is to produce the same effect on the modern reader that the original text had on its ancient audience.
Oh, I see.
So if a Hebrew idiom doesn't make sense to an English reader, the translator, using dynamic equivalence, will change the idiom to something modern that carries the same basic thought.
They prioritize the feeling and the reception of the text over the literal structural grammar.
Right.
Okay, think about it like architectural drawings. Formal correspondence is like reading a high-definition architectural blueprint. Every load-bearing wall is marked, every electrical wire is traced, and the measurements are precise to the millimeter.
I like that analogy.
And dynamic equivalence is like looking at a beautiful watercolor painting of that same house. The painting captures the mood of the house. It shows you what the house feels like on a sunny day.
But you can't build from it.
Right. If you try to build a roof based on a watercolor painting, the roof will collapse on your head. You cannot build a structure on a mood.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
So the question is, does that watercolor approach actually harm the person reading their Bible on a Tuesday morning?
The authors of our sources argue that everyday readers are definitely harmed by it.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, by smoothing out the grammar for modern ears, translators frequently alter the voice of verbs. Voice is a grammatical category that tells us who is doing the action.
Right, active versus passive voice.
Yeah. In an active voice, the subject does the action. In a passive voice, the subject receives the action.
Like, I hit the ball versus the ball was hit.
Yes. And the sources point out that modern translation committees often take a passive verb, where God acts and man receives, and turn it into an active verb, where man acts.
Oh, wow. So they flip who is doing the work.
Yes. And the texts argue that this subtly introduces synergism, which is the idea of cooperative salvation between God and humanity.
At the expense of monergism.
Right. It dilutes monergism, which is the doctrine that God is the sole actor in salvation.
That shift from passive to active literally rewrites the relationship between the reader and the text.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the reader thinks they are the ones producing the action.
Which is a huge theological shift.
The sources also mention that translators soften imperative commands to suit an anti-authoritarian culture. They take absolute decrees from a sovereign God and turn them into conditional advice.
It changes the tone completely.
It's the difference between a king issuing a royal decree that says, do this, and a modern life coach saying, you might want to try this strategy for your personal growth.
Yeah, if you soften the verb, you soften the God who spoke the verb. The grammar dictates the theology.
Okay, so to understand how translators make these subtle shifts, we have to look at how these ancient languages actually worked, because they don't operate like English.
No, not at all.
Western languages, like English, operate on time-based tenses. We think in past, present, and future. We ask, did it happen yesterday? Is it happening right now? Will it happen tomorrow?
Everything is plotted on a strict timeline.
Right. But the Hebrew verbal system operates on aspect, specifically perfective and imperfective aspect.
I want to stop you there because moving from time to aspect is a massive mental leap for anyone who only speaks English.
It really is.
If I say I walked the dog, that is past tense. If Hebrew doesn't care about the timeline in the same way, what does aspect actually mean?
Okay, aspect describes how the action is viewed by the speaker, regardless of when it happened.
Regardless of time.
Yeah. The perfective aspect views an action as a complete whole. The action is finished and viewed from the outside as a single event.
And imperfective.
The imperfective aspect views an action from the inside as something ongoing, incomplete, or habitual.
Okay, that makes sense conceptually.
To use an analogy, think of watching a parade. The imperfective aspect is like standing on the street corner watching the floats go by. You are in the middle of the action, and it is ongoing.
You're in it.
Right. The perfective aspect is like hovering over the city in a helicopter. You see the beginning, the middle, and the end of the parade all at once. You see it as a completed whole.
That makes a lot of sense. The perspective changes entirely. So how does that Hebrew concept of seeing an action as a completed whole play out in the actual biblical text?
The sources provide a classic example called the prophetic perfect.
Okay, tell me about that.
Look at Genesis 15, when God makes promises to Abraham about his future descendants and the land they will inherit. God doesn't use a future tense. He uses the perfective aspect.
Wait, really? For a future event?
Yes. God speaks of a future event as if it is already a completed whole. The action is so certain in the mind of God because his sovereign decree guarantees it that it is spoken of as a finished reality long before it happens in human history.
Wow. So if an English translator just renders that prophetic perfect as a standard future tense, writing, I will give you this land, they miss the absolute certainty of the Hebrew grammar.
They miss it entirely. I will do this. Sounds like a plan that could potentially be interrupted.
Like a good intention.
Right. But the Hebrew grammar says the event is already a completed reality in the mind of God.
The translator using dynamic equivalence might say the basic thought is the same, but they lose the divine weight of the original structure.
Yes, and Greek is a whole different system again, operating on entirely different rules.
The Greek system is highly developed. It utilizes a matrix of tenses, like the aorist, present, and perfect, along with a system of moods.
What did the sources say about those moods?
The sources point out a critical rule in New Testament syntax regarding those moods. The indicative mood makes factual assertions. It states what is true.
Okay, statements of fact.
Right. And the imperative mood gives commands. It states what must be done.
Got it.
The rule is that the indicative mood always precedes the imperative mood. The statement of fact always comes before the command.
Let me try an analogy here to make sure we are tracking with the sources. Think of a king who issues a full pardon to a prisoner.
Okay.
The king signs the document and declares the man free. That is the indicative. It is a statement of historical fact. The pardon is granted.
Right, it's done.
Then, after the man walks out of the prison cell, the king assigns him a job tending the royal gardens. That is the imperative. It is the command to live a certain way.
The sequence is vital there.
Well, spot on.
Yeah.
Because he is pardoned, he now works in the garden. If a translator reverses that grammar, or blurs the lines between the two, the text suddenly says, the prisoner must work in the gardens in order to earn the pardon.
We completely flip the relationship between grace and works just by mixing up the moods of the verbs.
Right. And that is the exact theological disaster the sources warn against. The authors argue that God never commands obedience as a prerequisite for salvation.
Never.
He declares a finished reality in the indicative mood, and then he calls for holy living based on that reality in the imperative mood.
You are saved, therefore live like this.
Right. If a translator flattens that sequence, it creates moralism. It turns a description of God's prior saving work into a legalistic checklist of human requirements.
Which is terrifying, honestly. The question is how a professional translator misses something so critical.
Right. The translators are brilliant scholars. They understand Greek syntax better than anyone. Why would they blur the line between a statement of fact and a command?
The authors explain that translating complex syntax trees requires distinguishing main verbs from subordinate participles.
Okay, meaning what?
Well, the Apostle Paul writes incredibly long, cascading sentences. In Ephesians chapter 1, there is a single sentence in the Greek that stretches from verse 3 to verse 14.
One sentence. That's massive.
It is a massive web of modifying clauses, participles, and prepositions. A translator has to figure out what the main verb is and what the clauses modifying that verb are.
That sounds like a puzzle.
It is. If a translator decides to break up that long sentence for modern readability, they might take a modifying clause and promote it into a main command.
Oh, I see.
When they do that, they distort the logical sequence the author built. They take a sentence that was meant to wash over the reader as a single, unified declaration of God's grace, and they turn it into a series of disconnected bullet points.
That shift turns the good news of what has been accomplished into a terrifying list of what the reader has to do.
Yeah, it changes the gospel into law.
And the sources move from these broad rules of syntax into some very specific case studies to show how individual verbs carry this theological weight.
What's the first case study they look at?
The first case study is John 19:30, the crucifixion. Jesus is on the cross, and he cries out, "It is finished." In Greek, that is a single word, tetelestai.
Tetelestai is one of the most significant words in the entire biblical text. Grammatically, it is a third-person singular, perfect, passive indicative verb.
Okay, let's break that down. Why does every part of that classification matter so much?
The perfect tense in Greek means the action was completed in the past with permanent, unalterable results that continue into the present.
Permanent results.
Right. The passive voice means the work was accomplished entirely independent of human effort. Christ was the active executor of the work, and the work itself was a fully completed reality.
And here's where the sources draw a hard, unyielding theological line. We are reporting the author's claims here, and they do not pull any punches.
No, they are very direct.
The text claims that this specific verb tense, the perfect tense of tetelestai, completely refutes Roman Catholic dogma. The authors state that the Roman Catholic view of the Mass involves an ongoing, unbloody sacrifice of Christ on the altar. The authors argue that if the work of the cross is perfect meaning, completed in the past with permanent, unalterable results, it cannot be ongoing.
An ongoing sacrifice denies the perfect tense of the verb.
Yes, that's what the authors argue. The sources also aim that same verb at Arminian synergism.
Right. The text argues that the Arminian view treats salvation as a potentiality, a finished work that seats waiting for human activation through free will.
Like God did his part, now you do yours.
Yeah, but the authors claim that the passive voice and perfect tense of tetelestai leaves zero room for human cooperation.
The grammar states that the work was fully applied and secured by God alone.
The grammar locks the theology into place, excluding both ongoing sacrifice and human cooperation.
It is striking how much theological combat is waged over the tense of a single word.
It really is.
The authors present another fascinating case study from the first epistle of John, chapter 3, verse 9. In English, older translations, like the King James Version, rendered this verse as, "Whosoever is born of God doth not commit sin."
Oh man, that specific English translation caused massive pastoral panic for generations.
I can imagine.
Imagine a person sitting in a pew reading that text. They know they lost their temper with their children that morning. They read, "Whosoever is born of God doth not commit sin," and they immediately conclude they are not born of God.
Because they committed a sin.
Right. It created an expectation that true believers must achieve absolute sinless perfection in this life. If you commit a single sin, you have forfeited your salvation.
But that English rendering seems to directly contradict what John writes earlier in his very own letter.
How do you mean?
Well, in chapter 1, John says that if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us.
That's a huge contradiction.
Yeah, John cannot be demanding absolute sinless perfection in chapter 3 if he just told his readers in chapter 1 that they are deceiving themselves if they claim to have achieved it. So what is the actual Greek verb doing in chapter 3?
The Greek uses the present active indicative verb poie, modified by the negative particle ou.
Okay, Greek grammar class, here we go.
The key to solving this apparent contradiction is the present tense. In Greek, the present tense carries a linear imperfective aspect.
Meaning ongoing action.
Right. It denotes an ongoing continuous action. It does not mean a single isolated instance of sin. The grammar literally means a believer does not walk in a continuous habitual pattern of sin.
That changes everything.
They do not practice sin as their unbroken lifestyle. The ESV translates it well by saying, "No one born of God makes a practice of sinning."
If I am a pastor sitting in my study looking at these Greek paradigms and parsing out linear, imperfective aspect, it can feel very academic.
Very disconnected from normal life.
Yeah. But the sources make a strong pastoral argument here. How does a pastor translate these academic distinctions into actual comfort for an anxious congregation?
Accurate verbs protect the listener from two very dangerous extremes.
Which ones?
On one side, you have the despair of perfectionism. That is the terrifying thought that one slip, one bad day means you are condemned.
And the other side?
On the other side, you have the licentiousness of antinomianism.
Antinomianism.
It means against the law. It is the idea that because you are saved by grace, you can habitually sin without consequence. You can live however you want because grace covers it all.
Okay, so by teaching the linear aspect of that verb, that a Christian will certainly struggle with sin but will not make peace with a habitual lifestyle of rebellion, the pastor offers both security and a call to holiness.
The grammar provides the pastoral care.
That's beautiful. The syntax is the guardrail that keeps the sheep on the path.
That concept of syntax acting as a guardrail leads directly into the largest case study provided in the sources.
The Ephesians text.
Yeah, the text gives a full expository outline on Ephesians chapter 2, verses 4 through 10.
Let's get into it.
To truly understand the grammatical weight of this passage, we have to establish the historical backdrop of Ephesus. Paul is not writing to a quiet, rural farming village.
Right. Ephesus was a major hub.
It was a massive, cosmopolitan, pagan metropolis. It was focused on the Temple of Artemis, which was one of the wonders of the ancient world.
And a lot of dark stuff went on there, right?
Oh yeah, the city was a center for occultism, magic, and imperial worship. The Ephesian believers lived in a highly pluralistic, hostile culture. They were surrounded by wealth, idolatry, and spiritual darkness.
They needed serious, unshakable anchoring.
Paul provides that anchoring by defining their exact condition before they met Christ. In the first 3 verses of Ephesians 2, he says they were dead in trespasses and sins.
And the sources make a very vivid comparison here to explain what that deadness actually means.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Often, modern preaching portrays the human condition like a drowning man thrashing in the water. He's going under for the third time, and he just needs someone to toss him a life preserver.
Right, the classic rescue analogy.
Yeah, in that scenario, he still has the ability to reach out, grab the rope, and cooperate in his own rescue. But the text argues that Ephesians 2 is not describing a drowning man.
What is it describing?
It is describing a rotting corpse at the bottom of the ocean. The person is absolutely dead. A corpse has no ability to see a life preserver, let alone reach out and grab it.
Wow. That is a brutal image.
But that brutal image of a corpse is necessary to set up what the sources call the greatest grammatical pivot in the New Testament. Verse 4 begins with two small words.
But God.
But God. The entire trajectory of the passage shifts. The focus moves entirely away from the deadness of the corpse and shifts to the unilateral action of the Creator. God steps into the graveyard.
That pivot introduces a series of words the authors call the verbs of union. Paul uses 3 aorist active indicatives, and they all share a specific Greek prefix, syn, which means with.
Those 3 verbs are the core of the passage.
Right. God made us alive with Christ. The Greek word is synesipoisin.
Oh,
He raised us up with Christ, which is synagiron, and he seated us with Christ in the heavenly places, which is synekathesin.
that since prefix is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
It establishes a federal and vital union between the believer and Christ. The corpse at the bottom of the ocean did not suddenly discover the ability to swim to the surface.
God executed the act.
Yes, and the believer was united to Christ in that resurrection action.
Then we hit the soteriological anchor in verses 5 and 8. Paul writes the phrase, saved by grace. The Greek phrase there is estisismoi.
Right.
What is happening syntactically with that specific phrase? Let's break it down for the listener who has never studied a day of Greek.
The phrase is a perfect passive paraphrastic construction.
That sounds like a mouthful.
Let's take that apart piece by piece. We already discussed the perfect tense. It means a completed past action with permanent, ongoing results.
Permanent results, check.
The passive voice means the action was entirely received by the subject. The subject did not contribute to the saving. They were the recipient of the saving.
Receive the action, check.
Now, the word paraphrastic sounds intimidating, but it just means using a roundabout way to say something by combining a helper verb with a participle.
Can you give me an English example?
In English, instead of saying I ate, you might say I have been eating. In this case, Paul combines the verb to be with a perfect participle.
What is the effect of doing that?
By doing this, Paul places massive rhetorical stress on the enduring state of salvation. He is saying you are in a present, permanent state of having been completely saved by an outside force.
God is the sole actor.
Yes. The human corpse was passive.
The passage pushes this even further in verse 8. Paul writes, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God."
A very famous verse.
The Greek uses the neuter pronoun tuto for the word this. This is a crucial grammatical detail.
Why does the gender of the pronoun matter?
Because it is a neuter pronoun, it does not point back to a specific feminine noun like grace or faith. It points back to the entire preceding clause. It points back to the entire salvation package.
The author of the source paper emphasizes that this neuter pronoun excludes all human boasting.
All of it.
It means that even the faith exercised by the believer, the very act of believing, is a divine gift. You did not generate the faith out of your own internal resources.
God gave you the faith so that you could believe.
The grammar demands that salvation is entirely a work of God from beginning to end.
Think about how people normally read this chapter in a Bible study. Most people skim right past those perfect passive verbs and land heavily on verse 10.
Verse 10 being the good works verse.
Right. Verse 10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them."
People love verse 10.
They do. They want to know what they should be doing. They want an action plan. But if you detach verse 10 from all those passive verbs in verses 4 through 8, it seems like you create the exact kind of self-help preaching the source text rails against.
You just end up with a list of tasks for the week.
The sources explicitly validate that concern. Preaching verse 10 without the prior perfect passive verbs turns the fruit of salvation into the root of salvation.
It reverses the whole thing.
It makes the congregation think their good works are the currency they use to buy their standing with God.
The text argues that good works are the path God prepared beforehand for believers to walk in because they are already saved.
Because they are already saved. That's key.
The grammar demands that we read the entire sequence in order. The indicative of the completed salvation must precede the imperative of the good works.
If you sever verse 10 from verse 8, you lose the engine and just keep the wheels.
And the car goes nowhere.
Then you wonder why the car refuses to move forward. You are telling a dead corpse to start doing good works.
That structural integrity of the text is what the authors say protects the church from falling into endless legalism.
And that brings us to the final section of our source material, which looks at what the biblical text actually is in its origin.
We are looking at 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17.
Right. This is the classic passage on the nature of the Bible itself. Paul writes, "All Scripture is God-breathed." The Greek word is theopneustos.
The source insists that the word theopneustos speaks entirely to origin. It literally means breathed out by God.
But a lot of modern translations say inspired instead of God-breathed, right?
The English word inspired is frequently used, but the sources argue that inspired is heavily misunderstood in our current culture.
How so?
Today, we use the word inspired to describe something that is uplifting or artistically pleasing. You might say a beautiful sunset over the ocean is inspiring.
Yep.
You might say a great piece of classical music makes you feel inspired. It describes a human reaction to an external stimulus.
It's about our feelings.
Yeah, but Paul is not saying the biblical text makes you feel a certain way. He is saying the text originated in the breath of the Almighty. It is a statement of divine origin, not a description of human emotion.
Think about a person exhaling into the freezing winter air. You can physically see the vapor of their breath. You know exactly where it originated.
It came from their lungs.
Right. You don't look at the vapor in the air and assume it just materialized out of nothing. Theopneustos is like that winter breath. It forces the reader to acknowledge the source of the words.
It changes everything.
When you view Scripture as the physical breath of God, it shifts your entire posture. You move from being a critic standing over the text, judging whether it is relevant to your life, to a servant standing under the text, listening to the voice of your Creator.
Yes, standing under the text. I love that.
The text outlines 4 active uses of this God-breathed word. Teaching, which is positive instruction in truth. Reproof, which is the conviction of error, and pointing out where we are wrong.
Correction and training as well.
Yeah, correction, which is the process of restoring the fallen person to an upright position. And training in righteousness, which is the disciplined formation of character over time.
We also have to remember the intense historical pressure behind these words. Paul is writing this letter to young Timothy from a cold Roman prison cell.
He knows he's going to die.
Paul knows he is facing execution. He is passing the baton. At the same time, false teachers are actively dismantling the local churches.
So things are falling apart on the outside.
In the face of death and widespread deception, Paul does not offer his young protege psychological tricks. He does not offer mystical experiences or pragmatic marketing strategies to increase church attendance.
He just offers the word.
He offers Timothy the absolute, unshakable certainty of the written word. The purpose clause at the end of the passage says this is all done, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work.
What's the Greek word for complete there?
The Greek word for complete is artios, which means fitness or adequacy for the task at hand. And the word exertismenos is a perfect participle indicating a thorough, settled equipping.
The sources position this grammatical reality as a direct argument against 2 specific modern movements.
Which ones?
On one hand, the text takes aim at liberal theology. The authors claim that liberal theology treats the Bible as a human record of divine encounters.
So treating it just like an ancient journal.
Yeah, in that view, the Bible is just ancient people writing down their spiritual feelings and tribal myths.
And the second movement?
On the other hand, the text argues against pragmatic evangelicalism. The authors say pragmatism evaluates a church's message by its market relevance, its entertainment value, and its ability to draw a crowd rather than its divine origin.
That's a strong critique.
The grammar here, that perfect participle of being thoroughly, permanently equipped by the breath of God, refutes both sides.
It says the text is divine in its origin, and it is entirely sufficient for the task.
You do not need to rewrite the history to satisfy the liberals, and you do not need the marketing department to satisfy the pragmatists.
The sources answer this by looking at the Christological center of all these verbs.
How does that connect?
The texts assert that the verbs of Scripture always point to the historical actions of Christ. He obeyed the law. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. He died on the cross. He rose from the grave. He currently reigns.
It's all action.
The grammar of redemption is tied directly to his historical actions in time and space. The authors argue that to blur the verbs through loose translation methods is to blur the vision of the Savior himself.
If a translator softens the verbs of his substitutionary death or his physical resurrection to make them more palatable to a modern audience, they lose the solid ground of the Christian faith.
The grammar carries the reality of Christ.
Let's bring all of this massive amount of information together for the person listening. We have covered incredible ground today.
We really have.
We started with the highly technical aspects of Greek and Hebrew syntax. We looked at the difference between time and aspect and how the prophetic perfect guarantees the promises of God.
We examined the rigid rule of indicatives coming before imperatives and how reversing them creates legalism.
We looked at how dynamic equivalence can unintentionally shift the theology of a passage by changing the voice of a verb from passive to active.
We examined the life-altering reality of perfect passive verbs, from Jesus crying, "It is finished" in John 19, to the reality of a dead corpse being saved by grace in Ephesians 2.
And we close with the divine, exhaled origin of the text in 2 Timothy.
The through line in all of this analysis is that words matter, and the structural syntax of those words matters even more.
The architects of these biblical texts use specific grammatical tools to build a fortress around the concepts of grace, sovereignty, and salvation.
When translators respect that architecture and preserve the exact syntax, the fortress holds strong against error.
When translators try to remodel that architecture to suit modern cultural tastes, the walls begin to crack.
The verbs are the load-bearing pillars of the theology. If you remove the pillars, the roof falls in.
That leads to a final thought I want to leave you with, something entirely outside the academic sources we reviewed today. Think about the verbs you use when you tell your own life story to a friend, or when you describe your own beliefs to someone asking about your faith.
That's a great exercise.
Pay attention to the syntax of your own testimony. Are you always the active subject of the sentences? Are you always saying, I chose, I found, I decided, I committed?
Or is God the active subject in your story?
Are you the recipient of his verbs? The next time you open a text, whether it is an ancient manuscript or your own journal, trace the action. Look closely at who is doing the doing. The grammar might just change the entire way you read your own life.
That's a great thought to end on.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sovereignty of syntax. We will see you next time.